Hi, my name is Noel Davis with World Composting, and today I want to cover a subject that we haven't talked about really. And for those of you that are already doing worm composting or composting in general, you could probably skip this video. It's one of the few times I'll say that, but I want to ask the question, is composting right for you? So I want to give my reasons for composting, and I sort of want to go into things to look for to make that determination whether you should take up this as a hobby or not. So let's start with asking the question of, should you compost? So some of the things you need are space. You might need an empty room. I do mine in the basement. You also have your yard you can do it in if you have a yard that you're allowed to do it. So those are some of the things that you might need to think about. So think about the space that you have where you could do a compost bin or composting with worms, or whatever system you want to do as far as getting rid of your food waste. Maybe bokashi. I had success with that, with burying it in the yard. It did smell, but it didn't really smell when it was in the bucket. It was only when I emptied it out. So maybe that's an option for you. Maybe you want to do worm composting, or maybe you just want to do a regular compost pile in your yard. And those are all viable options, but you need to make sure you have the capability and the room to do it. And I do in my basement, so that's where I do mine. So that's the first thing you need to look for is space. Number two, if you want to do worm composting, you need to be able to maintain the temperature. Now this is something I've had some issues with. My house runs a little bit chilly in the basement at times, but typically it's still not going to drop below freezing, and it's not going to get up into the 80s. I normally have it pretty well maintained, and since it's a basement during the summer, it doesn't get too hot. During the winter, it drops in temperature a little bit, but it's never freezing or anything like that. So if you want to do this outside, you need to make sure you plan ahead. I have that large bin at my parents' house that's outside, and it's done really well over 8 years, but my dad's finally decommissioning it, and they did have it freeze multiple times, and they couldn't really use it a lot during the winter because it would get so cold. So that's something else to think about. Now, the other thing that you really need to think about is if you decide to go with worms, what type of system you want. So you have the small 10-gallon totes that I started with, and they work really well. I also then have a larger tote, which is a 27-gallon tote, and it works pretty well. But once you get above 10 gallons, you need to drill holes in the bottom of it to let that air in. So after that, I then have my urban worm bag and Vermibag, and they work really, really well. I've been very impressed with how they work. It's very easy to harvest. The worms just stay in it. I don't have to try to separate them or anything like that, like with my 10-gallon totes, which take a little bit more work. And they work really well. I'm very impressed with them, but it's something that you might not want to start with a system that expensive, especially if you're doing this for the first time. You might kill your worms, you might overload the bin. It's easier to do it with a 10-gallon tote, I feel, for the first time, to make sure you're going to stick with it. Don't build up this huge population of worms after 8 months and be like, you know what, this isn't for me, I'd rather hire a service. So I'd rather people start small and grow. You can always add another tote if it works for you. If you start getting up to 4 or 5, it gets kind of complicated, in which case I'd recommend one of these flow-through bins, or you can build your own. I've done that as well too. So those are the first two questions you need to ask. The third question is, do you have the supplies necessary to run it? And I say this in all honesty because it wasn't something that really I thought of when I first started this. I knew I could get cardboard. I know I had food scraps, but I store my food scraps. You can't just add them to the bin as quickly as you make them, because you're going to overload your bin and it's going to get messy and fruit flies. It's going to be horrible. So you need a place to store them at least, and you want to kind of make sure that the worms are consuming what's there, and they will eventually build up to the food that you have. But it takes time, unless you're going to order 8 pounds of worms. But you want to make sure that you are going to actually have the food scraps necessary for your worms. And along with that, we have to talk about bedding materials. And I've got a video on that I'll link up above on bedding materials. And there's a lot of different types. You have cardboard that's free. You can buy wood chips. You can use sawdust. You can use cocoa coir. There's tons of things. Newspaper. I tend to use cardboard. I have used cocoa coir for some of my experiments just because it's more consistent. If I'm doing 2 bins side by side, cardboard can be, if I had cardboard to this bin, it might be a little bit more wet or something like that. Whereas if I use the same brick of coconut coir, it's going to be exactly the same all the way through with the moisture content and everything. So those are just some options that you have. And I know I'm sort of rambling here a little bit, but I just want to get you prepared. It's not something that you stick in a corner and you just forget about it. And I don't want people to do that. I don't want them to also kill their worms. I did that once by neglect, and I feel very guilty about it, and I don't want to do that again. And I posted a video about it because I wanted people to know that even somebody who has experience, at that point, I'd already had worms for 3 years, and I ended up killing a bin. It got completely neglected, and it was my fault completely. It's not the worm's fault. It's not anybody else's fault. My fault, and I take ownership of that. But I made sure that I didn't do that again. And I don't want anybody else to go through the same hassle that I went through because you overloaded yourself at the beginning. So with that, you have a couple other questions that probably you should answer, and that is it against the law where you live to have worms or to have a compost system? I started doing worms in my house because a compost bin is actually banned in my community. So my county that I live in, they ban them. It's against the law to have an above ground composting system. You can have one, I think, in the ground, but then it probably would conflict with my HOA rules as well. But you can't have an above ground one here. So, I started looking, and then eventually they did say, hey, you can do an above ground if you do vermicomposting. And the reason for it is they're worried about pests, such as mice and rats and things like that in this area. So that's why they banned compost piles. But that's why I started doing my worms. That's the whole reason why I did this. I didn't want to just throw my food scraps away, but at the same time, I had to make sure I complied with the laws that are in my area. And I highly recommend you do the same. So I'm not telling you to break the law. Make sure you check your local regulations and follow them. So, also double check for worm composting and make sure that you're not importing some worm that's banned from your area. So, I think there's some areas where blue worms are banned or red worms might be banned, or, make sure you double check to make sure you're not doing something that's against the codes in your area, because it's not my responsibility to check. I can't check everywhere in the world. You need to do that before you start on any type of composting system. Now, for those of you that live in cities and it's not convenient, double check online. You might be able to find a company that will take your compost, take your food scraps and turn it into the compost, and they might give it back to you if you want it. So I would double check into that. I know New York City and Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia, I think, has them. Some of these really big cities I know on the East Coast have them. I've done a little research into them, and they look like they work really well. I highly recommend you look into them because it might be a lot better than having something that's in your house that you kind of have to maintain, but not only that, is in your living area. So just some ideas. The last thing I'm going to bring up is, do you have a yard or someplace you can use your castings? Now, this is something, if you're living in a condo, you can use them in some of your potted plants and stuff, but if you're producing a lot more, you're going to need somewhere to take all of this good black compost to. I mean, it's great, nutritious stuff. You're going to want to use it with plants and everything, but if you don't have anywhere to put it, I still highly recommend you compost, but find somebody who can use it. I know that my yard, I don't have as many plants as I want, but my parents, they have a massive garden and they add a lot of compost to it, but I can always add some more if I need to take some over, if I don't have room in my yard, or I have neighbors that have gardens. So you can find people that will want this. They'll want it. It's really, really nutrient rich. It's really great for the soil. If you have a yard, you can also make compost teas and spray it on your yard and then just kind of dump over the last little bit, rake it into the soil. And I've done that a lot of times with mine, especially around trees where the trees weren't doing that well, and I'd kind of spray them down with this nice, rich compost tea, and it does really, really well. The trees reacted really well to it, and I even had a video where I actually dumped some compost in one section of my yard, and right next to it was a section that wasn't, you could see the outline of where the compost was essentially. It was green versus not green. Now, granted, this is just grass, and grass reacts really well to fertilizers, but it was very stark. I mean, it was very obvious to see how much it reacted with this grass to make it just grow much better. So those are some of the questions you really need to ask. I can't think of any others right now, but before you get started, start looking into these questions and make sure you're set up. Don't just rush into this. Don't just buy the worms and then think, I'll get it to work out. Have a plan and have things set up. You should have your bin set up before you get your worms. You should have some food scraps set up. You should have your bedding ready to go. This all should be ready before you get worms. And I just want to make sure that if you do this, you understand the responsibility you're taking. It's not just throw it in the corner and forget it. You really do need to maintain them, and they do take some time. Saying that, it's not that bad really as far as how much time it takes. It's, once a week you can add food scraps to them. So, and they can go for a few weeks without food. They can eat the bedding material. So they're not hard. It's just that, especially when you first get them set up, you really need to watch them because they will quickly just go into areas where there's food and then disappear into the rest of the bedding, and it's great. But then as the population gets up, that food goes quicker, and you need to make sure you capture that when it happens, so you can add more food and keep that population growing. So I'm sure there are questions. Please leave a comment below. I'll leave a couple links here on the side so you can see maybe some other videos that I have, such as my first worm bid that I did that was a 10-gallon tote, one of my my urban worm bags and my Vermibags, and then also the bokashi that I did. So those are some things to consider when you're doing this. And thank you for watching my video, and please like and subscribe.